Kia ora, I'm Dr. Peter Heenan. I'm a senior scientist at Manaaki Whenua Landcare Research based at Lincoln. I have a background in plant taxonomy and plant systematics and have been involved for most of my scientific career studying native plants in terms of how they're classified and how they're named.
Kia ora, ko Riki Nelson tōku ingoa. I'm the operations manager for Kaimai Kauri. We're based up at Katikati. We've got about 3 hapu at Katikati, working as kaitiaki, protecting our sacred taonga in the Ngāhere. My role is operations manager for a hapu-owned entity, which is Kaimai Kauri, and that is owned by 2 hapu. One is Ngāti Te Wai, my hapu, which I'm the environment rep for, and Taufau ki Ota Whiwhi, who is our other hapu that we're quite closely related to. The Kaimai Kauri, or the Kauri and the Kaimai, are the southernmost regenerating kauri forests in Aotearoa. So we took a team from Scion Manaaki Whenua up there to collect some seeds back in early 2019. And due to the observations and so on, they said that this was the healthiest kauri forest in Aotearoa.
So in Ngā Rākau Taketake, I'm leading a project on conservation genetics of kauri, and the real idea of that work is to understand the genetic diversity of kauri so we can manage it in response to the kauri dieback. We have very limited knowledge of the natural genetic diversity of kauri across the landscape. So from the far north to the far south, how does it vary naturally? So this project is to develop what we call population genetic markers, which are unique fingerprinting type markers. So if you're watching CSI programs on TV and they're talking about identifying a person who committed a crime and they've got blood or something from the scene, they will take that, and what they're looking for is DNA fingerprinting that can characterise that one particular individual person. And so we're operating a similar way with what we do with kauri. We're looking for, often not at the level of an individual plant, but certainly at the level of population, we're able to retrieve markers that can identify distinct populations. And so one of the things is we want to know if there are populations that have unique DNA fingerprinting that occurs nowhere else, because they would be quite important to conserve.
Kaimai Kauri, we've been around for a few years. Kaimai Kauri is now a limited liability company that is owned by 2 hapu. We needed a mechanism to identify resourcing and funding, to bring that funding down, to set up the framework and the structures to employ our people, to train, develop the capacity, capability, and to deliver services so that we can, start achieving some of our aspirations and some of our goals.
So in the case of the Kaimai and the Coromandel area, for example, the kauri of the Coromandel Peninsula might be quite distinct because to the north, west and south there could be quite different populations, and the Coromandel is known to have some unique species anyway, so the kauri could be genetically different. Now if we come back down to the Kaimais, then we've got a situation where the Kaimais are at the very southern limit of the kauri distribution. They're south of what is probably a distinct area in the Coromandel Peninsula, based on what we know about the sort of history of that region and the current flora. And so the Kaimai range is also a bit complicated in that it has deep incised valleys, like a lot of Northland does, and those different catchments may also have a different genotype of kauri. So in the case of an area like the Kaimais, it might actually be that you need to protect every catchment in there in terms of how you would manage the kauri. But it's really that understanding that these are our trees and these are how they differ in that unseen way of the genetic diversity that sits in behind what you can see as a giant forest tree in front of you. The word genome is bandied around and it's often a good all-encompassing phrase for the genetics of a plant. You can say it's in the genome. But in actual fact, what we're doing with the fingerprinting that I described earlier is we might work across the entire genome, but we're not sequencing the entire genome. And for something like kauri, that would be costing multi-millions of dollars because it's a massive genome, and to sequence each individual DNA nucleotide in there would be a massive task. For example, we've just been doing some work on kānuka, and we sampled the genome and we ended up with 1,300 what we call single nucleotide polymorphisms. So that just means single means one nucleotide, and one nucleotide that varies, the polymorphism. And we only had 1,300 of those from the entire genome that we were happy with, gave us a rigorous statistical genetic result. And so, that genome is probably, it'll be tens of millions of DNA bases long, and we were only interested in 1,300 that were scattered right across it. In terms of the integrity of the plant, we're not altering its DNA, and we're only really searching for and wanting to understand the variation in these more rapidly evolving parts of the DNA that have no real function in terms of genes. To be perfectly honest, one of the big challenges, as I see it, is that Maori have so much pressure these days in these local, environments where they're deemed to have responsibility for a piece of forest, and they're making decisions about that. They're under-resourced, understaffed. There's often a bit of a scientific gap, and that's quite a challenge as well for the scientists to explain clearly in an acceptable, non-threatening way that we're not going to be sequencing genes and selling those and making lots of money. That's the least of the technology we're using can't do that anyway, but it's a matter of that the technology we're using is pretty low impact and it shouldn't be really threatening. There's no commercial use in there. We're using standard scientific methods that are globally accepted. So, but that's a challenge for us to bring to them. And then, as I say, they've got the challenge of their resources primarily.
Back in 2018, 2019, we focused on our rangatahi, bringing them into the kaupapa with the aspiration of developing future employment for them. So we had one of our, she's actually our lead kauri track ambassador, which is Trinity Nikora, and she has been volunteering in this space on behalf of our hapu with the kaupapa since she was 16. She's been employed full-time since late last year with Kaimai Kauri. And not only that, she's 19 now, but she's got a leadership position. If you have a look at our team, all young, and there's a reason around that. We needed to make sure that we had a reasonably young team so that all of our youth could look up to and aspire to. We've had a few issues over the generations, unfortunately, with mental health and youth suicide, especially in Katikati. So there's a number of kaupapa that we're trying to drive and support our youth. Our youth need to have hope, and we believe taking them back to our roots. We were actually sea people in the moana, tofau, who were the seafaring people, but we also had our kaupapa that in the ngahere with the kauri and the rongo and that kind of thing. We know for a fact that when we take our people into the bush, there's a certain wairua in there that heals them.
They've got lots of demands, not only demands for biodiversity, but there's cultural demands of running their enterprise, meeting people's needs, which they take there's a completely different perspective on the world. There's the holistic Maori view, so there's a lot of resources and effort goes into the holistic approach, whereas scientists, we tend to compartmentalise things, and if we go and visit, we want permission just to do kauri from that site. It's a very small part of their world. So, there's a lot of things to understand there, but as I say, the best way to do that is to sit down and talk. And I've got to say, in terms of our hui at Katikati, talking to Carlton for 2 or 3 hours one evening was a brilliant experience. And then on the following morning, standing under a pahutakawa, having a pretty good kōrero with Ricky about the background of that marae and what they'd endured over the last couple of 100 centuries was pretty eye-opening and pretty interesting, and certainly gave me a real deeper perspective of where they were coming from and why Maori have such a broad holistic view and the concerns they have, which we really need to address through Te Tiriti in New Zealand.
We need to recognise the treaty partnership between us and the other partners, which are government entities. And they always talk about the capacity capability building. What does that mean? We need the resource and to grease the wheels so we can do the mahi. We need to get out there into the field. We need reliable, long-term resourcing and funding so that we can actually be kaitiaki of our natural resources. Collectively as tangata whenua, I think we need to start working together and collaborating. I really do believe that we have some really innovative initiatives down here in Tauranga Moana where we, I think we think outside the square, outside the box, and I think we can, the other iwi hapu can learn a lot from us. We absolutely need to learn what they're doing up Northland, what they're doing up at the Waitakares, and as well as Coromandel. We need to be collectively meeting, having hui wānanga, sharing, and that kind of thing. And here's the thing with government agencies, they need to be supporting this kaupapa. They need to be helping to enable us so that we're all working together, kotahitanga, across all kauri lands, rather than just our little plots here and there and that kind of thing, from the northern kauri all the way down to the southern kauri.
I guess that's the spark, is that there's always more stuff to learn about what these plants are, what their whakapapa is, and we look at that through DNA obviously and at different levels. So just an understanding how they fit into the environment, and these days that understanding is also the cultural environment, the human impact. If we look around New Zealand, we see large tracts of lowland New Zealand have been cleared and lost, and for productive purposes, for urban settlements. But the impact on biodiversity, and I'm not just talking plants here, it's birds, insects, etc., is massive. We can't keep having the impact we're having without some costs in there. There's got to be a tipping point, and as we hear with climate change and these pandemics that are going around and other pest organisms exploding, there's massive impacts happening. So it's really understanding the biodiversity so that we can manage those impacts and we can look to the future about protecting the resources that we've got left from what we've done to the environment.